Anyway, so this is kind of pursuant to a note I got from Meredith, but it's just a general thing about philosophy. We, what you do in philosophy, or what people think you do, is okay. There's this guy and he thinks this, and then there's this guy and he thinks this, and this is so what? They all just think different things. But actually, the core of philosophy was what was displayed by Mr. Plato from the get-go. This is philosophy. The philosophy is not a a doctrine or a set of doctrines. It's a practice or a habit of approaching any ideas. And so what we're going to do today is uh, we we talked about Aquinas last time. I mean, excuse me, Augustine last time, and we mentioned that uh, I'm going to use Augustine and Aquinas as the bookends of the Middle Ages. There's other ways to do it, but for my purposes, I'm going to do that. And the reason I do that is because Aquinas is going to introduce the teachings of Aristotle, and this was radical at the time. It's hard to realize this, but just about everybody we study caused some turmoil in their lives or in their teachings. And that's no less true of Aquinas than it is of Socrates, although he wasn't executed for it. I've heard two accounts of Aquinas. Ha First of all, you don't bring a pagan into scriptural studies. Why would you do that? And this is a radical thing for him to do at the time. A pagan is obviously not a Christian, and Aristotle is a pagan. And nevertheless, Thomas Aquinas was so impressed by his reasoning that he basically incorporated it into his thinking, his writing. And the idea was for Aquinas that Aristotle makes so much sense that it's impossible to believe that it isn't consistent with Christianity. And this is the same kind of thing that Galileo ran into and Kepler ran into, because those guys weren't anti-Christian. They were Galileo was kind of confident that he was doing something. His discoveries were something that would amplify the message of the gospel, not be contrary to it. And he was kind of gobsmacked. McAtee's taking me to task for the use of that word, but anyway, he was surprised that the powers that be thought that this was because how could the truth, which he saw with his own eyes, he saw the moons of Jupiter, which are still called the Galilean moons, he saw them and he went, wait a minute, they're orbiting around another planet. So how can we be the center of the universe on Earth if there's another planet up there that has stuff orbiting around him? Oh, sorry. Anyway, so he was really surprised that the Catholic Church didn't see it his way. And of course, he was had to go before the Inquisition and was sentenced to house arrest. Well, now, Aquinas, I've gotten two different stories about what happened to him, but one is that after his death, he was excommunicated, which was, of course, revised, but either way, he was at least censored for the idea of bringing a pagan into his thinking. And so anyway, we're gonna address two things of Aquinas. One is an ethical thing, which we're not going to do today, and that is the idea of natural law, which he also he gets that from Aristotle. And the one we're going to talk about today is proofs for the existence of God, which he doesn't, some of them he gets from Aristotle. Although Aristotle didn't believe in the kind of God that Christianity does. So we're gonna do that today, and there are five proofs for the existence of God. That Thomas Aquinas publishes in both the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. Those they're basically the same proofs in both books, but the Summa Contra Gentiles is directed towards people who don't believe in the Bible. And the Summa Theologica is addressed towards people who are beginners in Christian study and they want to have a more sophisticated view. And so the two books are similar. I mean, the two arguments that we're going to address uh, in each book, they're basically the same, but they're addressed to slightly different audiences. Um, these are not trying to appeal to your emotions. They don't use scripture, and they are meant to prove with cold, hard reason that God exists for the benefit of the non-believer, or the fool who in his heart says there is no God. That's Psalms 14. And also a quote from Anselm. I seriously doubt if even one human being has ever been persuaded to accept Jesus as his Lord and Savior on the basis of these arguments. That isn't because the logic is bad, which it is, but because that's not why people come to believe. I don't believe that people uh, generally come to any religion because they've been persuaded by the logic of some philosopher. They do it as a sanctuary. Maybe they grew up with it. This is what they're used to. Maybe they've had some trauma in life and they found uh, some kind of emotional relief or support or comfort in the church or their religion. I'm not specifically talking about Christianity here. Or maybe they're recovering from a drug or alcohol addiction, and this has been supportive of their process. That's why people are religious. They're not religious because some logic professor explained this to them and they became persuaded by the logic. I can't. And so, in a way, I'm going to throw in with Tertullian. A couple of people commented on Tertullian. I think maybe Neil did. Um, I don't think logic is the basis for Christian faith or any faith. And if when you attack it with logic, I'm not sure it doesn't fall on deaf ears because that's not why people are there. They're not there because it makes the most sense. Although that's what exactly what Thomas is going to try to do right now is make sense of it and support Christian belief by use of logic and evidence. So we're going to examine his process here and see if it holds water. And a couple of things to bear in mind. One is that we don't intend to prove that God doesn't exist. All we're going to try to show is that his arguments in support of God's existence are not valid, or they're not sound, is another way to put it. Um, Thomas he doesn't use these terms, but he makes a distinction between natural and revealed theology. Revealed theology is like Jesus was born of a virgin. There's no way that you could come to this conclusion by just being a scientist and kind of examining the world as it is. But Aquinas believes that the existence of God falls into a category that can be proved by logic. And that's what we're going to examine. So, again, this is called natural theology or natural religion, not revealed religion. So there's not going to be any reference to scripture in Thomas's proofs. And this, again, these are his rules. I'm not laying this on him. These are his rules. And Thomas was open to the power of logic, and he himself did not. We haven't gone over the ontological proof of Saint Anselm. Uh, we haven't gone over that. But anyway, Thomas didn't think that was a good proof, which shows that he valued logic. In other words, he's not just going to say Anselm is right because he's a Christian. He thinks that the proof isn't valid, and so he's not going to approve the proof, even though he approves of the faith. It's best to think, I think, to conceive of these proofs as like a CSI program. In other words, here's the situation we find, how best to explain it. That's what Thomas is. So he's trying to start just with what you can observe and what you can conclude from what you observe without being circular. In other words, you can't assume God's existence in any step of these arguments. So there are five famous proofs, and I'm going to concentrate on the fifth one, but let me tell you what the first four are. Uh, and they're fairly succinct. They're not really long, wordy proofs. I will read the fifth one to you, but the first and second ways, uh, basically the first one is, first and the second are have to do with cause. And the idea is that there is we see that there are events which are caused. And so this event was caused by that event, which was caused by that previous event. And at one point, there must have been a start. Now, this is a proof right out of Aristotle. Aristotle concludes there must have been an unmoved mover, somebody that started the whole shebang. And Thomas is going to say this we call God. That's very brief summation of the proof, but that's basically all it is. Now, all of these proofs make, I believe, the same error, and that is that the last sentence of the proof is always this we call God, or this all people call God. This is just factually not true. Nobody goes to church and says, uh, our first cause who art in heaven. Nobody's praying to the first cause. Nobody cares about the first cause. That is not why anybody believes in religion. So Thomas saying in every proof, in every case, he has this metaphysical proof, and then he says this everyone calls God. That's just not true. As a fact, if we're going to try to start with the facts, nobody calls God the first cause. Or maybe he does, but it's a very rare person that does. You go to God because you pray for the health of your child, or you pray that you'll meet the right girl, or whatever it is you're praying for. You don't pray for something to you don't pray to an impersonal thing like the first cause to hope for the outcome you're desiring. Yeah, Brian, unmute yourself.
There. It seems to me you've assumed a lot in that simple statement there, with that nobody looks for God as a first cause, and everyone is looking to God for some personal improvement or improvement for relatives and all. But can you really justify that? I think there are plenty of people who wonder where it all started and where it all came from.
Well, that may be true, and I'm willing to just grant that point, Brian. I don't care
Okay.
because if you say you think a lot of people are religious because they think there must have been a first cause to everything, I don't have empirical evidence to doubt that. I doubt it. I think most people have an emotional connection with the church and their beliefs, and it's not just a purely scientific one. But I can't prove that. You're right. Fair enough. But the main criticism of this proof comes from Hume, which is Hume, we haven't gotten to, but Hume allows two uh, basic lines of evidence. One is what he calls relations of ideas, and the other he calls matters of fact, what we've previously called a priori and a posteriori knowledge. In other words, uh, if Hume's going to say if you can't trace an idea back to an observed fact, then you have to throw it out. Or a matter of logic, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, we can grant that. But if you say something that cannot be traced back to an observed fact, then it's just an opinion. It's an idea of yours. It may be a forceful idea, it may be emotionally satisfying to you, but it can't be accepted as a fact. I mean, this is what we'd say in science. Now, Hume is rather harsh with that, but it's the same thing that Socrates says. And Socrates makes the distinction between knowledge and true opinion. In other words, true opinion is you could be right, but we don't have any proof of it. Knowledge is we have proof of it. So Hume's not doing anything really different from what Socrates does. And what Hume says is nobody has observed either an infinite regress or a first cause. It's never been observed. And as a matter of fact, physicists don't know right now, as we speak. No physicist. Who's the physicist here? It's Gerald. Uh, is it not the case that um, no physicist really can explain where the universe came from or how the we have the Big Bang, but we don't know what
Yeah.
caused we don't know what caused the Big Bang. Am I correct?
Yeah, I would say completely. We
Yeah,
You go back and there doesn't seem to be a good Big Bang, and nobody has a big picture that in any way justifies the existence of a universe.
right. And so some people have opined that the Big Bang itself was a black hole or something. I mean, I've heard a lot of I kind of turn my mind off when I hear these things because of Hume. I know nobody's observed any evidence for either of these things. So anyway, that's our criticism of Aquinas's proof number one and number two. The first one is from cause. We just discussed it. The second one is from motion, which is essentially the same thing, just using motion instead of cause. In other words, this is like Newton, whatever motion there was must have been caused by another motion. It's just the same structure as the first proof. The third proof is kind of my favorite, I guess. It's from necessity and contingency. And he says I could quote you the actual verbiage, but he says that there are some things in life which are contingent, like, for instance, for example, my existence is contingent. I could have not been born. But if everything, what the argument is, if everything was consistent, then in the infinity of time, there would have been a moment where nothing existed. If everything could go in and out of existence, then chances are that at one time nothing would have existed. And if that moment ever occurred, then nothing could come from nothing, just like Parmenides said. Nothing could have started to exist if nothing existed at any point. So what he says is therefore there must be something whose existence is necessary. Uh, Otherwise, nothing would exist. So somebody's existence must be necessary, and that being we call God. And I'll leave Brian to decide whether he thinks anybody decides that there must be a necessary being. But that that is the third proof. I'm going through these rather rapidly because I want to concentrate on number five. The fourth one is from gradation, he calls it, and what he says is in everything there is a better and a worst, or a least or a greater, and when it comes and things are. I should read this one. I guess I've got it, but when it comes to beings, they are more noble, more just, more true, more real. Some things are more true than others. And he says there must be something that is the realest and truest being, and that we call God. Um, because everything is graded. And I just think that's kind of a weird. Like, for example, a piano has keys, 88 keys, some are lower and some are higher. Are the higher ones greater than the lower ones? Uh, we have a variety of colors and different frequencies. Are the higher frequency colors greater than the lower frequency colors? It seems odd to apply that. Just because it's a higher frequency, is it a greater frequency? But Thomas wants to say that with regard to being, there are things that are lesser and things are greater, and there must be something that is the greatest of all, and that is God. That's the fourth proof. Um, all right. The fifth proof is the most emotionally powerful, and that's the one I want to concentrate on. And it's a very famous proof. It's called the teleological proof. Do you remember what teleology is? Telos. teleology from telos, and telos is purpose. And I'm just going to read this one out loud, and we're going to go through it sentence by sentence. This process you might find tedious, but this is the guts of philosophy. Philosophy isn't, well, I believe that the early bird gets the worm or something. That's not philosophy. Philosophy is the process that we're going to go through in the next couple of, or the process we've been going through. So anyway, here's Thomas. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. Hence, it is plain that they achieve their end not fortuitously, but designedly. Now, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is directed by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed towards their end, and this being we call God. So this argument is very similar to creationism, but it has a slightly different purpose. Creationism assumes that there's another theory, that is Darwin, and creationism tries to show no, Darwin can't explain this, so it must be God. That's creationism. Whereas what this is assuming nothing. Of course, Aquinas knew nothing about Darwin, but assuming there's no other explanation for creation, but he says that we want to prove the existence of God. So there are two different goals. Creationism tries to show that the alternative theory, in other words, evolution, is not correct. This tries to show that God exists just from the facts. Yeah, Barry.
Is this argument sounds a little bit like the intelligent design
Yeah,
argument?
yeah. Intelligent design would be creationism. That
Yeah.
those two are the same, but this is a little different. Even though much of the evidence would support either of those. The goal of Thomas is not to provide an alternative to evolution, it's to provide an explanation for uh, reality as we see it. So um, he gets this from Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle has four causes, the last of which is the uh, final cause or telos. And even among non creationists or non religious people, it's a common assumption that nature does things for a reason. By the way, that's inconsistent with the theory of evolution because evolution doesn't allow for forward thinking or planning. Evolution just does random stuff, and then whatever survives is the best solution. That's all it is. There isn't a better or worse in that sense in evolution. It's very cold-hearted in that way. Did somebody say something? Okay. Um, on the argument as a whole, taken as a whole, uh, I'm very fond of G.K. Chesterton's representation of it. He said, so one elephant having a trunk was odd, but all elephants having trunks look like a plot. Uh, so it looks like there's some kind of plan here, is what he's saying. Um, Now, this argument in as a whole is taken from that category of arguments that I mentioned earlier called argument ad ignorantiam. Argument it means argument from ignorance. Argument from ignorance is we don't know how this happened, so it must be God. I told you before that the three most common conclusions from this argument are aliens, gods, and some unknown civilization, right? So we don't have a good explanation for what's going on Earth, so it must be God, is essentially that's how weak this argument is, I'm sorry to say. Although it has great emotional power, and that's why I'm spending some time on it. So what we're going to do is go through it chapter and verse and see if the premises that are being introduced hold water. And so, one to start with, as a whole, he's trying to say that the universe, as we look at it, shows evidence of planning and forethought. That's what he's trying to show. And if you think about walking down, what he's trying to say is that the universe would look different if it didn't have planning and foresight and a purpose in mind. But if you, what he's trying to say is this: if you walk down the beach and you see, you're just walking along and you see rocks and you see sand and then you see an iPhone, you go, that was something made by a human being for a purpose, or even a hand. Doesn't have to be an iPhone; it'd be a hammer, as opposed to the things you're looking at that look like they were just produced by geology, just by, in other words, unknowing forces that just resulted in sand because of the erosion of silica in the Sierra. But when we see something like that, it stands out. And what Aquinas' problem here is that we don't have another universe that doesn't show evidence of planning to compare ours to. He's trying to say our universe shows evidence of planning. Well, what does a universe look like that doesn't show that evidence? In other words, we have nothing to compare it to. He's just saying that this is our only example of a universe, and he's saying that it displays evidence of planning. All right, now let's just take it sentence by sentence here. The first sentence is things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to obtain the best result. And I think what he has in mind here is something like an airplane or a car that's designed for a purpose. And I think he wants to say, like birds, look at birds, they have wings and they're all designed in a very sophisticated way to accomplish um, the purpose of flying. Uh, First of all, there's a lot of things that it's really hard to say that they exhibit having any purpose. Everything that's inanimate, uh, it's a stretch to say that the craters on the moon have a purpose. Well, exactly what is that purpose? You know, the moons of Jupiter, what is the purpose of the moons? And in order to find there's a purpose, you have to assume that there's a plan in which they are participating and accomplishing that purpose. You could say, well, Jupiter's out there so that the Earth will stay in or in the orbit that it's in. But that assumes there is a plan. There's nothing about looking at Jupiter that exhibits planning the way that a car would or even a bird would. So if we're going to accept this proof, it's not going to apply to the whole universe, the whole visible universe. It's only going to apply those things that seem to exhibit some kind of planning. And a bird is a good example of that. Yeah, Peter, uh, can't hear you.
Okay. What Aquinas says about natural bodies, though, suggests that he believes, maybe wrongly, that anything that acts consistently is acting in accordance with a goal or a purpose. So the fact that, the moons of Jupiter stay in their orbit would be to him, I think, enough evidence that there's a purpose somewhere, not necessarily in the moons of Jupiter, but possibly in God that planned all of this. I don't think any of the five proofs are completely convincing, but I once took a whole philosophy of religion course with Rogers Albritton, where he spent pretty much the whole semester course examining the five proofs, trying to show why they were powerful and interesting, but also why each one of them in some way or other failed. And I think the fifth proof is more interesting than the watch, Paley's "you find a watch in the garden, there must have been a watchmaker" idea, partly because it doesn't apply only to things like watches and cars, where you'd say they must have been designed. The fact, we don't have another universe to compare it to, but the fact that this universe seems to be a cosmos, maybe an unkind one, but still an ordered cosmos rather than a chaos, would seem to Aquinas proof that there is some kind of a God. I think
I
the huge jump is that must be the God of the Bible. That seems to me a completely
well that second,
invalid jump.
he doesn't give any evidence for that. But get to
No.
your first point, I would say that is a subjective opinion. That how do you know? Okay, I'll go on to my next point and address that. Um, how do you
Um,
know?
I
How do
have,
you know if it's achieving its purpose if you don't know prior to that what the purpose was?
right,
How do you know it's not failing to achieve its purpose?
right.
Maybe Jupiter was supposed to be another sun and it failed to mature into a sun.
Yeah,
How do you know what the original purpose was? And to say that it achieves its purpose, you would have to know what the original purpose was. And since there's no way of knowing that, Thomas can't say it's achieving it.
I agree with that. I think he's assuming that consistency of action or operation means there's a purpose somewhere, and I don't really agree with that. I have to be somewhere at 1 though, so I have to leave now. But thank you, Tony.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah.
Because I very much value your input, especially when
Yeah.
you think I'm full of shit.
Well,
No,
it's nice to
I
know
don't
that.
think that. But one other thing I would say is that the third and the fourth proofs about the necessary being and the perfect being are a lot like the ontological argument, even though they take a different form. So even if he rejected Anselm's argument there, he is almost using it with the necessary being and the perfect being.
We're going to run into this again when we get to Descartes and his proof for the existence of God. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it's
yeah,
good to know that you have a purpose.
yeah. That's right. Yeah, but but this goes back. What Peter is hitting at is let's go right back to Meno. How do you know the purpose if you how do I recognize the purpose if I don't know what the purpose is? You get into that quandary about you're assuming a purpose because it seems to do something, but
This is a circular argument, which is called in logic either begging the question or petitio principii is the Latin name, but it's assuming the thing you're trying to prove. And that's essentially what had to be done there. Barry?
Think I hear echoes of Aristotle in this too. Aristotle looking out at society and the way the roles that are played, for example, by men and women in society, and saying, well, this is natural. It's correct because it's in balance because it's what we see around us. Again, he didn't have the God deposit as the source of all this, but it seems like another way of addressing this idea that there's a natural order to things, and in this case, trying to use that as evidence of a God.
Yeah. Okay. All that's true, Barry. And of course, he did base it on Aristotle. Uh,
Well,
now, I'm sorry, who's that?
Brian,
Brian, go ahead.
it seems to me, the sense I get is he's looking around and observing things in nature and noticing a lot of consistency, but he seems to ignore inconsistency. And there's plenty of inconsistency in the natural world, things that happen occasionally for no apparent reason, like an aurora, for example. You don't know when they're coming. They don't appear on any pattern that's discernible. And so it feels a little bit like he's ignoring things that don't support his argument.
I think that's true. And also, what this leads into what the next point I was going to make. The phrase he uses is they always achieve the best result. And there are plenty of examples in nature where the best result is not achieved. kind of my favorite example. There's a lot of them you could mention in human beings. We have explanations for them now, but he didn't have them. Why do we have wisdom teeth? Why do we have an appendix? We have uh, the my favorite example is the panda's thumb, which is a book by Stephen Jay Gould, and it's about evolution. And the panda has an opposable thumb over here, but it also has five fingers that are the five fingers are a paw, like a cat's paw or a bear's paw. But then there's this sixth thing over here. And what it is it comes out of another bone lower in the hand or a wrist bone. And so that looks like something that was an accident that was kludged together. Why couldn't he do just like monkeys do and what we do? We have five, and that works perfectly well. But it seems like this was a weird adaptation of something that was a mistake. Stephen Jay Gould he actually has a whole book called The Panda's Thumb, and it's all about that particular thing. So it looks like some things are how we describe them now as they're vestigial. Well, like we have a tailbone. Why do we have a tailbone? We don't have a tail. So what's the point of that? And so it seems like there are things that exist in the world that don't exhibit perfect planning. And another theme to my counter argument here is going to be that you can only assume as much perfection in the creator as you see in the product. It's like a baseball player can't say I'm 1,000 hitter if he's only hitting 250. So you you can't assume that the create. I mean, you could assume the creator's perfect, but we're trying to go from the bottom up here. We're trying to, what does the evidence show? Well, the evidence shows in some cases craftsmanship that could have been better. And if we think it could have been better, you'd think God, who's supernaturally intelligent, could have thought of a better way to do things too. So, all right, let me uh, move along. There's another aspect to this, and that is in nature, we see lots of things that aren't nice. They aren't moral. They don't seem moral. A few of them are like, for instance, cuckoos, which are nest, not predators, parasites. They they lay their eggs in the nest of another bird, and their eggs hatch earlier than the bird's normal eggs do, and then they kill the rest of the birds, other little babies, because they're more mature. And the parents are too stupid to realize what's happened, and they just go ahead and feed the baby, even when it becomes bigger than they are. They don't realize it's not their baby. It seems like a wise creator would have avoided that problem. That's kind of an icky problem. And then there's things called parasitic wasps. I don't know if you want to get nightmares, just look up z zombie wasps or parasitic wasps. And what they do is like a wasp will lay its eggs. First of all, it paralyzes, say, a beetle. They do this, or a caterpillar. They do this to different species, and they paralyze them, and then they lay their eggs inside the living body. They're still alive, but they're paralyzed. And then the eggs grow into larvae, and the larvae crawl out of the body, the living body of the, say, caterpillar, just like in the movie Alien. And then the creepiest thing is the caterpillar, and this happens in ants too with fungus. Anyway, the creepiest thing is the caterpillar then weaves a cocoon around the babies that have just killed it, and the babies of these little larvae have eaten all of the insides of the caterpillar, so it's going to die, but it's got enough of a body left to create a cocoon, and then it dies. So it not only is eaten from the inside by the larvae, but it also creates a protective shell for the larvae so they can continue to mature while it dies. There's lots of stories like that in nature that aren't really very pretty, and they're not very aesthetically pleasing, and they don't even seem moral. Now, you could still say that's the best way to do things, but remember what I just said about what does the evidence show us about the creator? I can only reason from what I see to the manufacturer or the creator or the carpenter or whatever. That's the only amount of perfection I can uh, see from the evidence. Barry, yeah.
All these examples are drawn from nature that we're talking about. What about all the human imperfections that are so obvious and readily apparent? If everything that the creator did was perfect, how do you account for all the human behavioral imperfections?
Well, that's the problem of evil, which is related but slightly different. But remember, what we're doing is looking at a crime scene and saying what's the best description of the perpetrator. And so, if the evidence is imperfect, then we have to say that the perpetrator, or in this case, God, is not as good of a planner as we might hope. Deborah, you got your hand up.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like what Barry was saying. By the way, there's lots of funny stuff going on about insects and cockroaches.
On the comments.
Yes, on the
Oh, okay.
very funny.
Oh, Douglas wants to defend the parasitic wasp. Oh boy, uh, that's hilarious. Okay, I've never heard anyone defend it before, but I'm glad to see that they aren't alone in the universe with
More
their
interested in
support.
the ticks.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Have a
anyway, go
question.
ahead,
I have a
Deborah.
question. And this is a pretty big tangent, so you may not want to even answer it now, or maybe it's a dumb question, but I can understand for somebody like Aquinas or a priest, you might want God to be really a good guy because it's in your vested interest in your career path. But what's wrong with the belief that there's a God, but he doesn't make perfect things? The gods are imperfect, like, the Greek gods had a lot of character flaws. What's wrong with having a God that created a lot of this, but made a lot of boo-boos?
Well, I don't find a problem with it, but I think Aquinas would, because Aquinas is trying to produce a proof, evidence that a perfect God exists, one who doesn't have any flaws. And
Mhm.
that's scriptural. He doesn't want to produce evidence. We're going to get to more things like what you just pointed out, Deborah, but uh, his goal is to produce proof of the biblical God, even though he's not referring to Scripture. That's what his goal is, and what we're trying to determine is whether he's achieved that. And so I
Yeah.
would say, just to answer you, I'd say, well, it falls short of proving what he wants to prove. That's how I'd respond to that. All right, let me move on here. This kind of looking at details of an argument is, like I say, the guts of philosophy, and it can be tedious. So I apologize for that, but I'm just going to go step by step here through this. Um, Okay, so on the first sentence, if we accept it, we can prove, even if we accept it, we can prove God created only a part of the universe. In other words, the part that looks like it was planned, not the whole universe, and not necessarily with the best possible ideas, and not necessarily on purpose, and not necessarily with the best intentions. That's quite a few reservations to a perfect God. Okay, now let me go to the next sentence. Hence it is plain that they achieve their end not fortuitously but designedly, whatever they being the things of creation. Whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence as the arrow directed by the archer. I love this arrow directed by the archer because that's a very good illustration of what he's talking about. If everything is as senseless and unconscious as an arrow, matter, that being matter, God's creating something out of matter, uh, then how could it achieve what it achieves unless there's some intelligence behind it? And that, of course, we call God. Well, uh, the the problem is that in this case, I would argue that when people design things, and we're going to do more of this in a minute, this kind of criticism, when people design things, he's kind of got a human designer in mind, like a human like designer. Um, they don't always understand the whole thing. Like, in other words, you could be a boatwright and you could know how to make a boat, know how to make a perfectly good boat without knowing about fluid dynamics and all of the physics involved in naval architecture. Plenty of boatwrights are just boatwrights. They know how to design a boat to make it work really good because they have formulas. They have boilerplate stuff that they use. How do we know that the God that created the universe just had the plans kind of, and he knew how to do this. He'd done it before, maybe, but we don't know that he knew the ultimate truths behind this. There's no evidence that he did. Um, all right, let me move to the next sentence here, which is, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end. This being we call God. All right, so he hasn't shown us any evidence that God is a single thing. When we look at human design, like if you look at a car, cars were designed over centuries. First the wheel had to be developed. The same guy that developed the wheel didn't develop the V8 and didn't develop power steering and didn't develop computers. All the stuff that goes into cars now was completely separate. It was designed by a bunch of different people at a bunch of different periods for different purposes, and they were put together with a car. It would seem to me, if you look at the universe, it looks much more like it was put together by a bunch of different people. Why would one designer design, say, uh, people and also design mosquitoes that carry Lyme disease, or no, ticks that carry Lyme disease? Why would the same designer? It seemed like different crews were working on different designs that were at odds with one another. Why? How does Thomas prove that there's one mind behind all this? I'd say he gives no evidence for there being one mind. It's much more logical to assume that there's a bunch of different creators working at odds against one another than that there's a single creator with a single creation in mind. Yeah, Meredith.
Well, how, using the example of ticks, since we have evolved so that we don't have any natural predators, really, except each other. And so maybe God wanted to, mess around with things that could kill us that were other natural uh, uh, agents, like diseases. And, I had a theory that COVID was God's idea of a way to do away with a bunch of the older people on the planet because the planet is overpopulated and the older people have already had their lives, so let's get rid of them. And most of the people who died from COVID were older people, elderly. And but whenever I try that idea out on somebody, they say, "Oh, come on,
This was
that's ridiculous. God wouldn't do that." But I think climate change may be God's idea. He may have said, you're doing some things that are going to be really bad for you, and I'm going to show you how that works for you. And when you don't, you're stupid. You're an example of how I went wrong.
well,
I was trying to design a uh,
but Meredith, to do that,
super being. And
you have to assume the thing that's in question. You have to assume that there's a guy out there with a plan, and then so it's a circular argument. I had this argument with Philby. He said he was being an anti-vaxxer, and he said, diseases are just to cull out the weak. And I said, okay, so Philby, the Europeans, I told you this before. The Europeans did the Native Americans a big favor by bringing smallpox over here and killing two-thirds of all of them. That was some benign act on the part of God to kill all the weak. And Philby shut up after that, because he's a big fan of Native Americans. In other words, you can't assume that there's a plan, Meredith. That's what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove from the observed facts, and the observed facts, I don't think
Wait a
support the.
minute.
You're saying that there is a plan. Maybe there is a plan. Well, that's
Well,
not a.
I'm using observed facts. If we encounter something that kills off people who've mostly lived their lives, that's actually kind of a nice way to reduce the population because the planet's overpopulated.
Talk about the people who have COVID and are going to die in a week. I don't think they'd say it's a nice way. Meredith, that's completely subjective. I mean, you're just making that's what a religious person would do that already believes in God. This is what God's plan was to
So God
eliminate
created
old people.
old age, Meredith.
What?
Did God created old age then, apparently, huh?
Yeah,
Kill off
because
all the old people.
If
if
you
you've read Atul Gawanda on being mortal, you know that gerontology has proven that when you get to be about 80, the great majority of us start to fall apart. We're
if
right on
there's
the
a
edge of it.
if you
So
assume there is
COVID
a
was trivial compared to old age,
if you assume there is a plan, I've made this point before. Anything can be explained. I mean, people are constantly saying, well, God has a plan. No matter what happens to them in their life, they say God has a plan. And I don't know what it is, but he has a plan. Well, if you assume that, that's not what that's not what Aquinas is trying to do. He's trying to convince a person that doesn't believe in God that all this is best explained by assuming there or concluding that there is one. And what I'm saying is, I'm not sure the evidence achieves what he wants it to achieve. Barry, you had your hand up.
I think one of the underlying problems here is anthropomorphism, that human beings, in trying to conceive of a God, attribute human characteristics. So it becomes not some spiritual entity, but some superhuman entity. And so we therefore look for, the defenses of God, imply superhuman capabilities, and that leads you to these conundrums of poor proofs because they don't work.
Is it conundrums or conundra? I don't know. Anyway, I'm still there's still a couple more points I want to make here. So one is that even if we allow everything to go through here, there's a couple of things that Aquinas hasn't even addressed that I think everybody assumes about God that is a believer. Number one, he doesn't produce any evidence that there's any ongoing interest. The designer of my car doesn't care what I'm doing right now with my car. He has no interest whatsoever. So even if somebody designed this, even if there's a God that designed all this stuff, he's done. He designed it and he's done. That's the watchmaker thing. He doesn't have anything to do with what's going on now. I doubt if anybody who prays to God thinks that's the case. That again, he says this is what everyone calls God. I don't think so. I think people, when they pray to God, they don't pray to some entity that has no interest in them. So he hasn't proven that. A second thing that he hasn't proven is that God created anything. All these, if this is if we grant every other step of the argument, he doesn't prove that God created. Where did the material come from? The Bible, right at the beginning, says God created heaven and earth. He doesn't say there was this heaven and earth hanging around, but I decided to design it in a better configuration so it would achieve ends. No, God is supposed to, because so he doesn't offer any proof of God of any activity that involved actually creating the physical universe. That's not proven. And also, finally, I think who was it that made this point already? Maybe it was Jared or maybe it was Brian. He doesn't provide any link to the Christian tradition. We could agree with everything so far and even discount the thing about ongoing interest. It doesn't prove that isn't Vishnu that did this or Maui. that produced it. There's no evidence that the God of the Bible is the one that's been proven. Okay, so those are my arguments again. And let me say again, I don't mean to disprove that. That would be a whole other project to try to disprove that God exists. All I'm saying that this argument, number five, uh, I think Peter said that maybe three and four were stronger. I'm not sure. But anyway, I think none of them are satisfactory. And by the way, this might come as a surprise to you, but this is the position of the Catholic Church as well. The current position of the Catholic Church is that these do not prove the existence of God. What they do is bolster your faith if you already are a believer. So it's back to the Augustine idea of believe so that you may understand. So they can strengthen your belief in God, but the Catholic Church itself, correct me if you find I'm wrong, I don't think I am about this. The Catholic Church admits that they don't prove the existence of God. All they do is bolster your faith if you already believe. Whew! Okay, that is going through the five ways of Thomas Aquinas. Any further comments or disputations or refutations? Huh. Yeah, that's kind of disappointing.
Well,
But
maybe just to fill in the matrix a little bit with very much away from Aquinas. What about a God that was just doing fireworks on a grand scale and walked away, and the rest of this is just irrelevant? It just, oh, other stuff happened.
uh, oh, okay,
Meaning, what we
we're
see
gonna
as the universe is really irrelevant to God.
okay, we're throwing out Aquinas then because Aquinas's whole program is to show things are purposeful and therefore there must have been a creator because he's the only one that would have had the purpose in mind. So you're just saying some God was just goofing off and by accident he created the universe.
Right.
I'm kind
And
of
it's
fond,
not relevant to Aquinas. I agree.
right. I'm kind of fond of that idea just because it's whimsical, but I doubt if that could be demonstrated either.
Well,
How does
a lot of the I'm sorry, go ahead.
no? I've just always wondered how the concept of infinity fits into this whole thing.
Well, were you here when we discussed the first and second proofs? Because that's what they're about.
Maybe not.
Aristotle and the Greeks in general were horrified by the idea of infinity, and so the proof of God from cause, which is the first proof, is that there's we can see there are strings of causes and effects, but they had to have a beginning. They couldn't just go on to infinity. And so there must have been a first, what Aristotle calls an unmoved mover that started everything in motion. And as Gerald and I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we still don't we still don't have any idea. Everything disintegrates. All of our physics disintegrates when we get to the Big Bang. So we still don't know what caused it. But what this is in logic is an argumentum ad ignorantium, an argument from ignorance. We don't know what happened, so it must have been God. That's not evidence. That's not positive evidence for God doing it. It's just saying, well, we give up. God is the best thing I can think of.
So Tony, if they objected to infinity, what do they think is going to happen the other direction at the quote end of time? Does God go away? Is there an end? Or does the church, does Aquinas not deal with that end of infinity? Just asking.
When you say they, you're talking about Aquinas.
Well, Aquinas or the church in general, but
Okay.
Aquinas specifically as a representative of the foundational philosophy of the church.
Well, at the end of days, there will be Judgment Day. That's as far as they don't get into the cosmology or the astronomy or of this. They just say at the end of days there'll be Judgment Day, and we'll all be judged for our sins.
Right. But do they? I mean, if they don't like infinity, at one end, how do they manage infinity at the other end?
Well,
Does the
that's an
universe go
excellent
away? Does
question
God
that
go
I don't
away?
believe Thomas ever addressed himself to. Uh,
Just curious. Just
no,
curious.
I like that stuff. What about this? Uh, yeah, I can't answer that. Uh, Thomas is this is by the way, Thomistic thinking along these lines. It's very structured. If you read, you could read, in fact, you could just go look it up on the internet, the Summa Theologica, and just see how it's very structured the way he thinks. And it's meant to be very persuasive. It's meant to be solid as a brick, that, okay, here's a question. Here's an answer to that question. Here's why that answer isn't any good. Here's my answer. Here's a criticism to my answer. Here's an answer to that criticism. And it's very structured, very impressive, and unfortunately replete with fallacies. Meredith?
I just want to say that human beings are so terribly flawed. I can't imagine that we are the highest and best that God could create. And so is he just waiting for us to do ourselves in, and it's going to be ugly and terrible?
You expected
And
me to answer something like that, Meredith?
well, I mean, where does philosophy go with that? I
We
mean,
don't.
how can you? As far as I'm concerned, I have no purpose. I have no purpose to be.
That's not true. You have a purpose. Every day you get up and you have a purpose. Everybody has a
No,
purpose.
no, no, no. I mean a
I'm
real
not,
purpose, not
well,
just to make sure that the family's fed and that the grandchildren are
what do you
loved.
want more
You
than
know,
that? What do you want more than
what do
that?
you want more than that? Well, maybe if Bill Gates had a purpose until Trump smacked him down, and now he's kind of given up on it. I mean, some people do have a purpose. I don't have that kind of purpose at all.
I think you do. You went to law school. You practice law. What are you talking about? That's silly to say you have no purpose. You're not just floundering around in the gutter smoking crack.
But
You're.
I might as well be.
Hey,
What do you?
I might as well be.
if you had Bill Gates' money, you would be doing a lot. You would have a bigger purpose.
Well, she's doing pretty well. Melinda.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
she gives her money, which keeps it increasing almost faster than she could give it
That
away.
doesn't make her purpose or Bill's any more important than yours. Yeah, Doug. By the way,
yeah.
Doug, something funny in the AI, you're always Julia. I always have to figure that out. Julia said,
I can't change the name.
I understand, but when I go through the AI, description of the discussion, I go, Julia, where was she? And then I realize it's you. Anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted.
It's her Zoom. She's
Yeah, I
paying
get
for
it.
the
I
Zoom.
get it.
So I keep coming back to this idea of infinity because aside from just the time aspect of infinity, there's so many other aspects that you could say there are infinite possibilities of conscious beings out there. Some of which may be infinitely smarter than whatever we think God is. The universe is gigantic. Where does it? Are there spatial limits on? You know, different gods get different portions of the universe or something. I mean, it just the whole concept of infinity starts throwing in lots of problems in there. I think.
I find infinity terrifying, frankly. I mean, if I can't think of where there's an end, that is just terrifying.
Yeah,
So let's
but it
just
could
leave
mean
it
an
alone.
infinite of anything. I mean, anything could
Yeah.
be infinite. Yeah, I mean, it's like
Well,
you
like
know,
when I don't like the idea that when I die, I'm going to be dead for an infinite amount of time. I don't like that idea.
well,
Speaking of terrifying,
yeah. Who said that? Tony. Okay.
uh,
Yes.
Deborah, were you trying to say something?
No, I wasn't. I just think
Oh,
you're going to be reincarnated in about a few billion years. Don't worry.
oh, thank you.
I
That's
will.
reassuring, Deborah. I
I know.
appreciate that.
We aim to please.
Be nice if we
um,
had some choice in the
But
matter.
yeah.
um,
So I want to go back to what Meredith said. So what is the difference in Bill Gates or Melinda Gates's purpose? just because they have more money. If you had the same conceptual approach, your purpose and their purposes would be the same. They just had more money, right? If you wanted to make malaria go away, one of their purposes, if you had that same purpose, that's a purpose. I mean, the magnitude seems to me doesn't matter. There's either purpose or there's not.
Do you remember what Rosalind Carter said about, when they moved back to Plains, Georgia? She said, well, we used to discuss nuclear proliferation. Now I'm worried about the walkway to the road from the road to the door. And they're just as one wasn't more important than the other. That's Rosalind Carter. Uh, Here, I want to make this point. I don't think I made this point that when you think, I was talking about how structured Aquinas was, he was very influential, still is very influential. We'll talk about his ethical teachings that are still guiding the church to this day. Um, this is called scholasticism. So if you ever hear the term scholastics, like if you're a scholastic or scholasticism, this applies to the kind of thinking that Aquinas did and that was very influential. Also, speaking of influence, there's only two philosophers that we're going to discuss this semester who had influence that was substantial in public affairs. They're Aquinas and Marx. A billion people, at least conservatively, were influenced by the thinking of Aquinas, the Catholics on Earth, and a billion communists on the planet also influenced directly. There aren't a lot of people directly influenced by Hume and Descartes, but Aquinas and Marx had direct influence and continue to have direct influence on the lives of well over a billion people in both cases. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And in both cases, they are ethical concerns that guide people's choices. Whereas right now we're just talking about kind of a metaphysical idea, whether God exists or not. The ethical thinking of Thomas and Marx are going to uh, influence the thinking of billions of people. So next time, that's what we're going to get to is Thomas Aquinas on natural law. And so that's what awaits us. Anything else? Did we cover? We mentioned Anne, and I think we got Doug's health situation completely straightened out. Uh, so we hope the best for Pat, and like that. Is there something we haven't done today, mentioned that we need to mention, or more on this topic? All right, then we'll leave it at that, and we'll see you Thursday, and we'll be talking about natural law.
Thanks, Tony.
All right,
Tony.
guys.
Thanks, Tony.
Here.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. See ya.